Hello and welcome to Renegade Files, your weekly fix of paranormal events, unsolved mysteries, covert culture, and all the weird, crazy, fun stuff. I'm your host, Lex Gordon, broadcasting from the Jungle Villa Outpost, deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files, episode 110, Michael Hastings, Fierce Journalism, Car Cyber Attack, and Cover-Up. Michael Hastings was a war reporter, a national security correspondent, and one of the few journalists of his time willing to confront institutions that viewed transparency as a threat. His stories took him from the streets of Baghdad to the halls of Washington, from Occupy Wall Street tents to the foreign policy machinery of the Obama era. He documented what he saw, named the systems he questioned, and refused to soften his reporting to preserve access or prestige. Along the way, he earned awards, raised alarms, and made powerful enemies. In this episode, we trace the life and legacy of Michael Hastings through the events that shaped him, like his early years and rise in journalism, his time in Iraq, his on-the-ground reporting of Occupy Wall Street, his critiques of drone warfare and Obama-era foreign policy, and his increasingly direct warnings about secrecy, surveillance, and the national security state. Was Hastings simply a fearless reporter who had an accident in the end, or did his work put him in the crosshairs of organizations that operate in the shadows? This is the story of a journalist who kept asking questions when others stopped, and a mysterious ending that still leaves one last question. What really happened to Michael Hastings? Please follow Renegade Files right now on whatever app you're listening with. Our follower drive is underway, and you can help just by following the show. Following Renegade Files is fast, free, keeps you connected, and helps new listeners find us. So tap follow right now, and thank you so much. This is a lot of information here. This episode is it's not incredibly long, but it's a little bit, and it's definitely dense. I've done tons of research for this, and it's put me at the very end of the window to put the episode up. So, because of that, I'm not going to edit out every little glitch, man. So just give me a break. I'm going to maybe have a mistake or two in here, but that's part of the human content that we love. That's how you know that this show is not AI. All right, so part 1, early professional life and brief journalist biography. Michael Mahone Hastings was born in Malone, New York on January 28, 1980. He grew up in a family that valued education and followed careers that required attention to detail and clear communication. He was still young when the family relocated to Montreal, where he spent his early school years in a bilingual environment that exposed him to international perspectives. His family moved again in the early 1990s, this time to Vermont, where he finished high school. Friends and teachers later described him as smart, curious, independent, and unafraid to challenge ideas. These traits would define his approach to journalism as he matured. After high school, Hastings attended New York University and later transferred to Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. At Hamilton, he studied English and developed a focused interest in writing and foreign policy. During these formative years, he began studying the landscape of modern conflict journalism, reading the work of war correspondents and long-form investigative reporters. He graduated in 2002, just as the U.S. was entering a period of overseas conflict and foreign policy upheaval. Hastings began his journalism career at Newsweek as an unpaid intern. The early 2000s were a transitional period for U.S. media. Digital journalism was expanding. Traditional print outlets were adapting to a faster news cycle. And foreign news coverage was becoming more prominent due to the war in the Middle East. Hastings entered the field at a moment when a young reporter could gain visibility by being willing to go where established journalists may not want to. He finally earned a paid position at Newsweek and proved that he could work within these new demands, chasing stories, gathering info quickly, and filling clean drafts that conveyed urgency without losing clarity. His move from intern to correspondent didn't happen through networking, but by him demonstrating a willingness to pursue the difficult material. By 2003, he was working as a Newsweek reporter and contributing to coverage of U.S. foreign policy and military actions. He spent time learning how major news organizations handled overseas assignments, how correspondents coordinated with editors from remote locations, and how fact-checking worked when the subject matter was volatile and sometimes classified. During this time, he also experienced the changing relationships between journalists, the military, and government institutions, relationships that became increasingly complex as the Iraq War evolved. His first experiences with conflict reporting took place in the mid-2000s and shaped his future approach. Unlike some reporters who built careers through domestic political reporting before branching out internationally, Hastings developed his career from that international perspective. He learned to navigate foreign cities, military units. He learned to interview refugees and file stories under time pressure. His reporting style was direct and observational, and he often used personal detail to show how policy decisions played out among civilians and people on the ground. Editors liked his determination, his persistence in gathering primary source material, and his ability to organize chaotic events into coherent narratives. By his late 20s, Hastings had earned respect within Newsweek as a reporter who could handle overseas assignments responsibly. He learned to work in conflict zones, coordinate with photographers, and manage the logistical challenges of reporting during active military operations. These were not skills that every young reporter had acquired, and they set him apart in his early career. By the end of the decade, Hastings had become a recognizable figure in the world of national security reporting and modern war correspondence. He had produced credible coverage of the U.S. military actions and diplomatic efforts abroad, and he had a reputation for pushing deeper into stories that other journalists approached cautiously. This period established him not as a pundit, but as a field reporter with first-hand experience in the environments he covered. His early professional path built the foundation for the work that would later define his public identity, his influence, and the controversies that inevitably followed. And if you enjoy these reports and want to help keep this independent show going, join the Renegade Files agency on Patreon. Your support there directly funds everything it takes me to do to make this podcast for you. It's long hours, it's writing, it's hosting, it's research, to make an episode just like this for you. So go to Patreon and help me keep doing that. Help keep this show ad-free and fiercely independent. Every new agent gets bonus content, the Dark Intel Files, which is all the research and photos and documents from every episode, and secret dispatches from me. All of this only available to the RFA agents on Patreon. But more than that, you become part of a very small group of listeners, hopefully growing, that makes this work possible. If you believe in digging deeper and questioning the narrative, then join me at patreon.com/renegadefiles. There's a link in the show notes. And become an RFA agent today. I'll see you in there. And thank you again to everyone who's an RFA agent already. Sincerely, you make this possible. Part 2. Baghdad and Loss. In the mid-2000s, Michael Hastings shifted from emerging national security reporter to full-time war correspondent. That transition also marked the beginning of the most personal and devastating chapter of his life, one that he later documented in his 2008 book, I Lost My Love in Baghdad, A Modern War Story. The book chronicled the relationship between Hastings and Andrea Parhamovich, a young woman working to promote democratic institutions in Iraq, and it documented his experience as a journalist during the Iraq War while living with the consequences of losing someone in a conflict zone. Hastings first traveled to Iraq in 2005 for Newsweek. By that time, the conflict had already gone through major phases. The initial invasion had passed. I think that was Operation Desert Storm. And that country was struggling through insurgency, sectarian tensions, and attacks against both civilian and coalition forces. Journalists faced daily risks that included roadside bombs, mortar fire, and kidnapping. Hastings learned how to maneuver through Baghdad under these circumstances, often relying on military escorts, armored vehicles, and local drivers who understood the city's constantly shifting dangers. During this period, he met Andrea Parhamovich. She was working for the National Democratic Institute, an organization that offered political training and support for emerging civic institutions in Iraq. She coordinated workshops, training sessions, educational programs, all of that. Her work caused her to have to move frequently around the city, that being Baghdad, and she had to communicate with local leaders. She had to develop an understanding of the security environment. Colleagues described her role as demanding and significant, especially for someone navigating Iraq's political landscape under such difficult conditions. She performed it, by all accounts, very well. Hastings and Parhamovich developed a relationship while both of them were living and working in Baghdad. Not an easy thing to do. They spent limited time together because of the security situation and their respective jobs. Their connection strengthened, and Hastings was reporting on the war while also trying to build a private life with her, and their relationship took place in this backdrop. So military convoys, fortified compounds, restricted movements. For them, ordinary activities required planning and seriously protective measures. It was a new love that couldn't just frolic down the street and dip into any cafe. So social interaction for them took place in guarded areas, inside well-secured buildings, or places that were considered safe enough for foreign personnel. In January 2007, Parhamovich was traveling from the NDI headquarters to an event when her convoy was ambushed. The attackers used small arms fire and homemade explosives, and Parhamovich and 3 security contractors were killed. The incident was a targeted attack against a convoy associated with Western personnel, and it demonstrated how dangerous the city had become for civilians. News of her death reached Hastings while he was still covering a story. He later described the experience as a breaking point that altered his understanding of conflict, foreign policy, and the cost of war. He returned to the U.S. with the goal of documenting what had happened. He analyzed the circumstances of the attack endlessly. He analyzed the work that Andrea had been doing and the relationship that they shared from an objective viewpoint. That process led to the creation of I Lost My Love in Baghdad, which was published in 2008. And of course, as objectively as he could, right? The book was part memoir, part relationship narrative, and part war reporting. He wrote about his time in Iraq, but also about his personal grief. He explained their first meeting, their relationship in Baghdad, what it took, the final days leading up to the convoy attack. He documented the logistical challenges of living in a war zone, from transportation schedules to compound living. Readers learned how a reporter assembled stories while coping with the constant threat of violence. Reception to the book noted its candid tone and its focus on the human cost of war. Because of this, that book stood apart from many war memoirs because it centered on personal loss rather than military strategy or political analysis. Hastings had showed how war affected people who were not soldiers. The book contributed to the public understanding of Iraq by demonstrating that sacrifice extended beyond battlefield casualties. This chapter of Hastings' life dramatically shaped his future reporting. It taught him the consequences of war at a scale that could not be learned through brief assignments or remote observation. It gave him an understanding of how foreign policy decisions translated into real outcomes for people. That book became both a record of his own experience and a memorial to Andrea, whose work in Iraq also ended in tragedy. The book marked a turning point in Hastings' development as a journalist, and it influenced the direction of his subsequent career. Part 3. The McChrystal Rolling Stone Fallout. Remember to follow Renegade Files right now on whatever app you're listening with. Just tap follow. Thanks. In the late 2000s, Michael Hastings had become known for his foreign policy reporting and for documenting the realities of war through firsthand experience. By 2010, he was contributing to Rolling Stone magazine, and he had earned a reputation as a reporter who pursued unfiltered narratives from the field. This reputation set the stage for one of the most consequential magazine articles of the post-9/11 era. In 2010, Hastings traveled to Europe to work with General Stanley McChrystal and his staff. McChrystal was the commander of the U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, a position that carried enormous strategic responsibility. Hastings was granted unusual access to McChrystal's inner circle, both during official business and during off-duty periods. The general, that's McChrystal, and his aides were traveling through Europe in preparation for a NATO meeting in Brussels. Their schedule included strategy sessions, media engagements, and diplomatic briefings, all related to the ongoing war in Afghanistan. Hastings observed their conversations, and these revealed frustration with the Obama administration and with other civilian leadership. So Congress, essentially. During informal interactions, some aides of McChrystal criticized U.S. diplomats and senior officials by name. Hastings documented these remarks, including comments that were dismissive of Ambassador Carl Eikenberry, Vice President Joe Biden at the time, and elements of other members of the U.S. diplomatic corps. These exchanges demonstrated a breakdown in communication between military leadership in the field and civilian leadership in Washington. After Europe, Hastings continued following McChrystal and his team back to Afghanistan. He observed briefings, strategy reviews, and planning sessions. He witnessed how military leadership discussed counterinsurgency operations, troop deployments, and political pressure. His notes included both on-the-record and off-the-record comments, though disputes later emerged about what participants believed was off-limits. Hastings returned to the U.S. and drafted the article that would become The Runaway General, published in the June 22, 2010 issue of Rolling Stone magazine. The article portrayed McChrystal and his inner circle as deeply skeptical of the leadership in Washington. It quoted aides referring to Washington officials with open frustration. It described General McChrystal's strained relationship with the Obama administration, specifically regarding troop strategy and counterinsurgency doctrine. What was unusual about this article was that the Pentagon and the White House reacted very quickly after the publication. The remarks documented in the article raised questions about civilian control of the military, adherence to the chain of command, and professional conduct by senior officers. Military leaders are expected to follow directives from elected officials, and the U.S. Constitution places the U.S. military under civilian authority. When a commanding general and his staff openly criticize those civilian policymakers, that conflict triggers direct concern at the highest levels of government. Within days, General McChrystal was summoned to Washington. On June 23, 2010, after meeting with the president at the White House, McChrystal submitted his resignation. President Obama accepted the resignation and selected General David Petraeus to replace McChrystal as commander in Afghanistan. The decision marked the first time in decades that a magazine article of a senior military leader had led directly to a leadership change during active conflict. Public reaction to the incident was intense. Commentators debated whether Hastings had violated journalistic norms by publishing such candid remarks from off-duty sessions, while others argued that accountability required transparency regardless of social context. The Pentagon reviewed the article to determine whether operational security had been compromised. Investigations concluded that no classified information had been exposed. The article also sparked criticism from political commentators and journalists who believed Hastings had broken unwritten rules about access reporting. In foreign policy journalism, reporters in bed with military units sometimes built relationships with commanders through trust and discretion. Critics asserted that Hastings had taken advantage of those relationships by publishing private remarks. Hastings rejected that position, arguing that journalists served the public interest, not the interests of those in power or those that power covered. The debate revealed a tension between two models of reporting: access-based journalism and accountability-based journalism. Hastings later described the situation as an example of how government and media had softened their scrutiny of military leadership during the War on Terror. He stated that transparency had been replaced with careful image management, and that the public deserved to know how war policy was actually debated among those directing it. His article became a flashpoint for discussion around the relationship between the press, the military, and the government. The fallout continued beyond McChrystal's resignation. Civilian and military leaders examined how dissent and the chain of command could influence policy, and media outlets reevaluated how they covered generals and other officials during wartime. Hastings became known as a journalist unwilling to comply with expectations that limited his critical reporting. His decision to publish the remarks in full demonstrated his belief that reporting on war required independence and objectivity rather than deference. So his decisions to publish the remarks in full, as it were, right? The McChrystal incident elevated Hastings to national prominence and marked a turning point in his career. It showed how a single article could change military leadership during an ongoing war, and how journalism could impact national policy. For Hastings, it affirmed the purpose of journalism as a mechanism for public accountability, regardless of institutional discomfort or professional backlash. Part 4. The Operators. 2012, Scandal Criticism and Media Whiplash. The events that followed the Rolling Stone profile of General McChrystal marked a decisive turning point in Michael Hastings' career. The profile had been a short-form magazine feature, but the reaction to it had revealed a deeper story behind the modern American war machine. Hastings had witnessed firsthand how policy strategy, media influence, military culture, and private contracting all intersected during times of war. He had also experienced how quickly powerful institutions reacted when their internal agreements became visible to the public. Those dynamics motivated him to expand the material into a full-length book, which he titled The Operators: The Wild and Terrifying Inside Story of America's War in Afghanistan. This was published in January of 2012. Hastings positioned The Operators as a detailed exploration of how wars were managed behind closed doors. Instead of repeating the Rolling Stone article, he traced the mechanisms that supported the war effort across multiple layers of government and private industry. His access to McChrystal's staff during the European trip had offered him a starting point, but he had also gathered a wide range of interviews, field notes, and observations during his time in Afghanistan. From these materials, he constructed a narrative that examined the Afghan conflict through the lens of policy decisions, strategic failures, and bureaucratic interests. One of the central ideas in The Operators is that the war effort relies on an expanding network of private contractors and consulting firms, many of which profited directly from prolonged military engagement. Hastings described companies that provided intelligence support, training services, diplomatic planning, and armed security. These firms operated alongside the military, but without the same public accountability structure. Their employees carried out roles that blurred the line between civilian consultants and military personnel, or military action. Hastings highlighted how this outsourcing model had shaped the way modern war was conducted and how it insulated decision makers from consequence. We've talked about it before on the podcast that private industry businesses are not subject to the same Freedom of Information Act requests as government organizations. They don't have to comply with them. In addition to private contractors, Hastings investigated the influence of public relations and messaging. He documented how senior commanders coordinated with media specialists to craft narratives about the progress of war. Press briefings, status updates, these strategic communications, they're designed to maintain political support and manage expectations. Hastings argued that these messages are often disconnected from the ground realities reported by field officers and soldiers. He suggested that the war depended on maintaining a certain public image rather than on demonstrating measurable improvements on the battlefield. This is very interesting. The book's release sparked immediate controversy. Supporters praised Hastings for exposing information that had remained obscured within official briefings. Critics accused him of undermining national security and harming the reputation of military leaders during an active conflict. Some suggested that his book would discourage future military cooperation with journalists, while others argued that transparency strengthened democratic oversight in wartime and at all time. Pushback came not only from individuals, but from institutions. Portions of the national security community rejected the book's portrayal of the Afghanistan campaign as dysfunctional. Former military officials claimed that Hastings had relied too heavily on personal anecdotes and inside gossip. Hastings countered that those anecdotal accounts illustrated how policy is actually formed rather than how it's presented to the public. He defended his methodology, stating that frontline truth often enters the public domain through informal communication rather than polished institutional reports. One of the strongest waves of criticism came from media organizations that traditionally acted as intermediaries between government officials and the public. Several high-profile journalists argued that Hastings had broken unwritten rules by refusing to protect the reputations of the senior officials who had granted him access to the information. Hastings responded by pointing out that the job of journalism is not to preserve reputations, but to deliver accurate information about matters of public interest. His stance exposed a philosophical divide in war reporting. Some journalists worked within the access-based frameworks that encourage cooperation with military leaders, while others pursued accountability models that challenged these official narratives. The Operators pushed this divide into the open. Another layer of conflict developed around the book's financial and political implications. Hastings examined how defense contracting budgets had grown since 2001 and how the Afghanistan war had created profit channels for companies with direct ties to lawmakers, defense communities, and think tanks. He described a cycle in which prolonged conflict generated recurring revenue for those firms. Critics viewed this as an attack on the military-industrial complex. Supporters argued that financial scrutiny was necessary because taxpayer funding supported those enterprises. Hastings extended his criticism beyond the battlefield and into Washington, where lobbying, policy research, and media commentary shaped foreign policy decisions. The book also drew attention to the relationship between civilian and military leadership. Hastings discussed how senior officers navigated disagreements with political leaders in Washington, sometimes quietly and sometimes openly. Sometimes it's all about money. He argued that the Afghan strategy had been built on assumptions that no longer matched reality, and that military leaders faced political pressure to present progress even when conditions deteriorated. Those themes resonated during a period when the United States was re-examining the cost of prolonged war. All right, some coffee here. That's a cliche, but it's true. As the debate intensified, Hastings' profile grew. He appeared on national television, participated in panels, he gave interviews in which he defended his book's conclusions. He maintained that the Afghan war had managed a combination of ambition, bureaucracy, and public relation rather than clearly defined objectives. His critics argued that he lacked a long-term strategic perspective required to evaluate such military operations, but Hastings replied that the war had lasted longer than World War II, and it still lacked coherent definitions of success, which was itself evidence of institutional failure. The response within military circles was particularly sharp. Some officers accused Hastings of betrayal for publishing material that cast commanders in a negative light. Others acknowledged that the book raised legitimate questions about how decisions are made. Hastings noted that lower-ranking soldiers and non-commissioned officers often spoke more openly about the war's shortcomings than senior officers did. This would be a normal thing. He viewed this as a sign that institutional culture discouraged frank discussion at the upper levels. So, in other words, as you rise, you go along to get along. You play ball or you don't even get there. Journalists also debated whether Hastings' approach would influence future war reporting. Some feared that access for all reporters might become restricted. Others argued that access should not depend on protecting those in power from scrutiny. Hastings was the latter. He insisted that if institutions reacted to transparency by limiting access, the response revealed something about the institution rather than the journalism. He was a clever guy, man. You didn't push him into a corner because he had answers. The social and political climate surrounding the book, The Operators, amplified the book's impact. Public opinion had shifted. Many Americans questioned the purpose of the Afghanistan war by 2012. Economic pressures, rising casualties, unclear outcomes, all of this influenced that sentiment. Hastings' book provided context for those doubts by illustrating how problems in the war effort emerged from bureaucratic systems rather than from isolated incidents. But the consequences of publishing The Operators extended beyond criticism. Hastings became a polarizing figure within national security journalism. Some viewed him as a necessary corrective in a field that had grown too differential to military authority. Others viewed him as reckless. He continued to write about foreign policy, intelligence, and national security issues, and the conflicts produced by the book The Operators followed him the whole way. They influenced how officials interacted with him, how media outlets portrayed him, and how audiences interpreted his work. By the time the reactions to that book settled down, Hastings had become a journalist who openly challenged institutional power in wartime politics. He had documented how information flowed through the government, military, and private channels, and he had revealed how those flows shaped national policy. The fallout from that book demonstrated that genuine scrutiny carried professional consequence. It also showed that reporting on war involved more than documenting battles. It required confronting the systems that made the wars possible and, most importantly, profitable. Part 5. Occupy Wall Street. When the Occupy Wall Street movement began in September 2011, Michael Hastings approached the movement not from the perspective of partisan alignment, but as a field reporter interested in how modern protest movements formed, organized, and interacted with the state of power. He traveled to New York City to cover the demonstrations and dug himself in with the protest environment to observe how messaging, logistics, and confrontation was unfolding in real time. His reporting on Occupy Wall Street was a continuation of his broader interest in decentralized political movements, public dissent, and the mechanisms that shaped responses from media and government institutions. The Occupy Wall Street protests started as a loosely organized economic justice demonstration centered in Zuccotti Park, a small plaza in Manhattan's financial district. Protesters criticized income inequality, corporate influence in politics, predatory financial practices, and what they described as the erosion of democratic accountability. Hastings arrived during the early stages when many mainstream outlets still viewed the encampment as a temporary spectacle. He spent time interviewing participants, observing organizational meetings, and documenting how the movement communicated its goals to the public. One of the early characteristics Hastings noted was the horizontal leadership structure of the movement. Decisions were made in public meetings known as General Assemblies. These involved call and response communication techniques, hand signal voting procedures, and consensus-based decision making. So they were sort of going old school. Hastings documented how these processes were both strengths and weaknesses. They encouraged participation, gave protesters a sense of ownership, and allowed for a diverse array of viewpoints, but at the same time they slowed down decision making and made it difficult to produce unified statements that could be communicated quickly. Throughout the fall of 2011, Hastings continued to cover the protests as they grew into a nationwide phenomenon. Encampments appeared in major cities like LA, Oakland, Denver, Chicago, Boston, DC. Technically not a city. Each local demonstration developed its own internal dynamics, but all shared a broader critique of financial power and political unresponsiveness. Hastings tracked how these separate nodes interacted through social media, live streams, and shared documentation platforms. This decentralized communication allowed the movement to spread without traditional party structure or any formal leadership. As Occupy Wall Street gained national attention, law enforcement responses escalated. Hastings focused significant attention on the tactical and legal measures taken by police departments. He documented the methods, batons, pepper spray, formations, mounted units, nighttime clearing operations, all of that. He reported how some cities adopted negotiation-based approaches while others emphasized rapid clearing. He also reported on the coordination that occurred between municipal governments, police departments, and federal agencies. These actions revealed that Occupy Wall Street was not simply a local protest, but a national law enforcement challenge, and that it required interagency coordination. This is something that would be right up Hastings' alley. Hastings also explored how media outlets framed these protests. Early coverage frequently dismissed the demonstrators as disorganized or unfocused. Hastings found that that wasn't the case, especially in the beginning. He countered that the movement's lack of formal structure was precisely what allowed it to grow across boundaries. He observed how Occupy Wall Street blended economic critique with demands for transparency, how participants used physical occupation as both a symbolic and literal tactic. The physical encampment served as a visible challenge to both corporate power and municipal authority. And Hastings explained that the encampments gained meaning through their permanence, rather than through rapid protest marches that came and went. By late 2011, political figures began reacting to the movement. Everyone had an opinion about it. Some politicians acknowledged public frustration. Others characterized the protest as disorderly disruptions. Hastings documented these responses without aligning himself to either side. He focused instead on the implications for democratic engagement, civil liberties, and police power. He noted that the policing models used during Occupy Wall Street would likely influence future responses to mass protests, especially in cases involving economic or political dissent. One of Hastings' contributions during this period was his attention to the lived experiences of the protesters. He wrote about how they organized food distribution in medical tents and libraries and media centers. These practical details showed how the encampments could function as self-governed communities. In doing so, Hastings pushed back against the narrative that reduced these protests to ideological slogans. He emphasized the logistical and social labor involved in maintaining such physical spaces under constant threat of removal. As winter approached, coordinated police actions dismantled the encampments across the U.S. Hastings covered these operations as cities issued evacuation notices, public health codes, park ordinances, safety regulations. In other words, they used all the tools in their toolbook to get rid of these guys. A lot of times they got rid of them at night, carried on their little nighttime tours. This avoided media exposure. Hastings reported that the speed of these operations, the number of arrests, and the property seizures that followed, and how they stood out in contrast to previous protests. He documented how protesters attempted to regroup through mobile demonstrations, but in the end, the whole thing fell apart. After the dismantling of the camps, Hastings accessed the legacy of the movement, or assessed the legacy of the movement. He concluded that although Occupy Wall Street lacked legislative achievements, it had shifted national discourse on equality, corporate accountability, and economic policy. Terms like the 1%, the economic inequality, these things entered mainstream debates and political campaigns. Hastings viewed this change in sort of a narrative as significant because it demonstrated how a decentralized movement could influence the public. So, from a conspiratorial lens, the failure in the long term of Occupy Wall Street because really what did it do? It put a few catchphrases into the public nomenclature. That's about it. So the failure of Occupy Wall Street really didn't lie in its messaging, which did resonate globally and stick, but in its inability to convert cultural disruption into structural reform. We can all agree that did not happen. The encampments were cleared, the news cycle moved on, and Wall Street resumed operations with very little interference. While activists debated process and identity, financial institutions pushed forward with high-frequency trading, derivatives expansion, and risk models backed by implicit government support. The bailouts were a clear signal that major banks would not be allowed to fail, and that lesson has shaped the decades that followed. Observers argue that instead of changing Wall Street changed its public face. Corporations embraced polished diversity campaigns, ESG branding, Pride Month parades, and high visible social activism. These gestures created a progressive aesthetic, but the underlying financial architecture remains unchanged. Banks continue lobbying for favorable regulations, gain access to new asset classes, and shape policy during crises. When retail traders briefly disrupted the markets during the GameStop short squeeze, the rules were rapidly adjusted and trading platforms restricted their access. Laws and margin requirements were recalibrated to reassert institutional control. From this perspective, Occupy Wall Street is viewed not as a revolutionary spark, but as a controlled release of public frustration. It highlighted grievances, but it didn't really threaten capital flows. The conspiratorial conclusion is that the system absorbed this protest, rebranded their own public image, and continued extracting value from Main Street through fees, inflationary pressures, taxpayer-backed protections, and more. In this framing, the money still flows upward, and the slogans were the only part that actually trickled down. Part 6. Obama-era foreign policy and Hastings' public critiques. After covering domestic protest movements like Occupy Wall Street, Michael Hastings returned to national security reporting with a sharper focus on the use of executive power in foreign policy. During the Obama administration, drone warfare expanded significantly across Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and other regions. Hastings studied these developments through interviews, policy analysis, field reporting, and examination of official statements. His work during this period centered on targeted assassinations, secrecy, and the normalization of undeclared conflict. At the start of Obama's first term in 2009, drone strikes were already present within the U.S. counterterrorism strategy, but they had not yet become a central pillar of foreign policy. But over the following years, the Obama administration increased the frequency and geographic scope of drone operations. The strikes targeted suspected militants, facilitators, and training camps. Civilian casualties were reported by independent organizations. And Hastings paid close attention to how casualty figures were calculated and how the administration defined combatants. Official definitions often treated unidentified males in a strike zone as an enemy fighter, unless proven otherwise. Hastings viewed this as a statistical technique that reduced reported civilian deaths without changing battlefield reality. Hastings also examined the legal framework that supported drone operations. The administration relied on the authorization for use of military force passed after the September 9/11 attacks. I guess I should say the 9/11 attacks, using it as a basis for military action across multiple countries without formal declarations of war. This is the catch here. So this is something that doesn't get spoken about very much then, and definitely doesn't now. The fact that the Obama administration was able to use the authorization for use of military force that was passed after 9/11 to apply military force without Congress's approval or without a formal declaration of war. So Hastings argued that this interpretation expanded presidential authority and bypassed congressional oversight. He wrote that drone warfare operated under classified legal opinions and targeted killing memoranda that were not available to the public, which weakened democratic accountability. He challenged the idea that secret law could justify lethal force abroad without public scrutiny. Okay? So imagine if it came out that that was happening now. I'm not saying it isn't, but it most definitely was in 2013 when President Obama delivered a speech at the National Defense University defending the use of drones as precise and humane. Obama stated that drones minimize civilian casualties compared to traditional military operations, that targeted strikes were necessary to prevent future attacks. Now, it is possible that that's absolutely true. Hastings followed the speech closely and responded through multiple published articles and interviews. He argued that the administration had reframed perpetual war as a form of humane global policing. He wrote that official assurances of precision were not supported by independent reporting and that secrecy prevented serious policy evaluation. Hastings also criticized the cultural presentation of drone warfare. He noted that media appearances by administration officials often emphasized technical sophistication, accuracy, and restraint. He argued that this messaging sanitized the realities of war and concealed the psychological and political effects in regions that were under surveillance. He documented how drones created a constant threat environment for civilians who lived beneath them, even when strikes did not occur. University studies, regional reports, and interviews with local populations described anxiety, displacement, and long-term trauma linked to continuous aerial presence. These details rarely appeared in official briefings, and Hastings used them to challenge the administration's public narrative. Another theme in Hastings' reportings was the institutional reliance on intelligence that was created through partners in the private sector. He studied how targeting data came from a mix of intelligence, geolocation tracking, and human sources. He noted that intelligence errors could produce lethal outcomes without clear avenues for investigation or compensation. He also noted that oversight mechanisms for contractor involvement were weaker than those applied to uniformed military personnel. This raised questions about accountability in cases of misidentification or wrongful death. Hastings viewed these conditions as structural problems rather than isolated incidents. His critiques expanded beyond drones to include broader elements of the Obama-era foreign policy. He argued that the administration inherited a global conflict model and then institutionalized it rather than dismantling it. In his view, a Democratic presidency provided political cover for expanded surveillance, raids, targeted assassinations, and all because traditional opposition groups were less vocal under a liberal administration. He stated publicly that the national security state had become bipartisan and that drone warfare was evidence of its permanence. He called this phenomenon a continuation of Bush-era neoconservative initiatives under new liberal branding. Very interesting. During this period, Hastings also challenged the relationship between journalism and the White House. He described how access-based reporting soft-pedaled national security critiques in exchange for access, interviews, leaks, and press briefings. He argued that this dynamic benefited the executive branch and harmed the public's ability to evaluate foreign policy. He drew attention to how whistleblowers and independent researchers provided many of the details that challenged official narratives on drones, and how independent researchers and whistleblowers had started to become framed as the enemy. He also wrote about the Department of Justice's investigations into leaks and how the investigations discouraged government employees from speaking with journalists. Hastings' criticisms intensified following the disclosure of the U.S. citizenship status of some drone targets. The most notable case involved Anwar al-Awlaki, a U.S. citizen killed in a drone strike in Yemen in 2011. His 16-year-old son, also a U.S. citizen, was killed in a separate drone strike weeks later. The administration stated that this person posed an imminent threat, but they did not release any evidence publicly. Hastings accused that case as highlighting unresolved constitutional questions surrounding due process and assassination. He argued that if citizenship did not protect an individual from a targeted killing without a trial, then executive power was effectively unconstrained in this domain. By 2013, Hastings had become one of the most vocal critics of Obama's counterterrorism approach within the mainstream media. He did not dispute the existence of terrorist threats, but questioned the long-term consequences of perpetual drone warfare that essentially had no oversight. He argued that the strategy created grievances, empowered extremists, and expanded the geographic scope of conflict without clear strategic endpoints. His critiques gained attention because they challenged the prevailing image of the Obama administration as cautious and multilateral in foreign affairs. This period of Hastings' career reflected a continuation of his core interests. So this is sort of what he grew into based on where he had come from. He focused on institutional power, secrecy, and the public's right to understand national security decisions. His reporting on drone warfare was not limited to casualty counts or political speeches. It examined the legal, cultural, technological, and psychological dimensions of that form of modern conflict. It also demonstrated that his willingness to challenge powerful institutions extended beyond high-level military leadership and into the very highest level of the government. It's really interesting. So before we move on into the final part here, just a heads up, the next episode is going to be a ghost hunting trip. And I've mentioned that a few times. Maybe we talked about it back in October. But this coming weekend, Agent Sheila Stone and I are traveling to take a tour and do a Renegade Files ghost hunt in the May Stringer House, which has been called one of the most haunted locations in Florida. We'll be taking a tour of the house for the first hour, then conducting our own investigation after that, and in that time, we'll record audio for the new episode. The episode will be a combination of our conversations on the way to the house and our recordings within, plus an analysis of the things we find once we finish. We have all the gear, like EMF meters, a spirit box, LED pods, EVP recorder, more. We both took the Renegade Signals Ghost Hunting 101 course on Substack, so we are fully prepared. And you can take that mini course for free also. There's a link to the Substack in the show notes. That 3-part course is totally free. It's really fun. The Ghost Hunt show should be fun too. Be sure to tune in next week for the Ghost Hunting episode. So on to part 7, the crash, death anomalies, and cyber car attack theories. Before Michael Hastings died, his reporting had placed him in direct conflict with political operatives, military officials, national security consultants, intelligence analysts, lobbyists, contractors, heavy-duty media figures, and more. His work on General McChrystal challenged military leadership during active conflict. His book on Afghanistan questioned the integrity of Washington's foreign policy establishment. His coverage of Occupy Wall Street documented how law enforcement and financial interests respond to populist dissent. His reporting on drone warfare identified legal and ethical faults inside the Obama administration and the national security state. These topics involve institutions with global influence, large budgets, and established media allies. In the final years of his life, Hastings became more outspoken about intelligence agencies, surveillance programs, and revolving door relationships between government, corporate defense industries, and major news outlets. His criticism was directed towards systems rather than specific people. He viewed security and secrecy as a threat to democratic accountability. The national security state viewed leaks, unauthorized disclosure, adversarial reporting as operational challenges. This environment produced friction. Hastings understood that friction, and he chose to work inside it rather than around it. That choice created admiration from some and hostility from others. On June 18, 2013, Michael Hastings died in a single car crash in Los Angeles at approximately 4:25 a.m. He was driving his silver Mercedes C250 at a high speed when the vehicle collided with a palm tree on North Highland Avenue. The impact caused an explosion and a fire that destroyed the front of the vehicle. Hastings was pronounced dead at the scene. In the days that followed, official accounts attributed the crash to high speed and loss of control. Witnesses reported that the car was traveling extremely fast just moments before the collision. Surveillance footage from a nearby business showed the vehicle passing at an unusual rate of speed. The crash appeared violent enough to eject the engine and transmission assembly from the vehicle. Photographs from the scene showed the engine block resting dozens of feet away. Some automotive experts noted that this level of separation was unusual for a standard collision with a fixed object at street level. Others argued that certain high-speed impacts can produce similar effects depending on the angle of the crash. In the weeks after the crash, speculation developed for several reasons. Hastings' last known email communication included a message to colleagues stating that he was working on a major story that he believed was under FBI investigation. The FBI later stated that Hastings was not under investigation at the time. Some journalists and associates interpreted the email as evidence that Hastings felt pressure or was aware of surveillance of his activity. Others believed the email reflected stress connected to his ongoing reporting. Reports also surfaced that Hastings believed his communications were being monitored. He told friends that he intended to go off the radar for a period of time. There were claims that he contacted lawyers who specialized in national security issues. He had recently published highly critical articles about senior intelligence officers and surveillance practices, including pieces on the CIA and the Obama administration's handling of leaks. These details weren't proof of foul play, but they became part of the context that fueled the alternative theories. One of the most discussed theories involves the possibility that the car was hacked. In 2013, proof of concept research had demonstrated that late model vehicles could potentially have their acceleration and braking systems manipulated through onboard computers. At cybersecurity conferences, researchers had shown that remote access through telematics or wired service ports could influence throttle control or disable brakes. This is terrifying. These demonstrations attracted attention in intelligence circles. Journalists noted that the U.S. government had explored cyber operations involving vehicles for covert actions, and these discussions had entered the public domain through congressional testimony and available policy papers. The speculative theory suggests that Hastings' car could have been compromised electronically, hacked into, causing uncontrollable acceleration and preventing braking response. So in other words, they could have hacked into his car, floored it, and drove him into a tree. Supporters of this theory point to eyewitness accounts describing no skid marks at the scene, a straight, high-speed trajectory directly toward the tree. They also pointed to the timing of the crash, shortly after 4 a.m., when road traffic was minimal. Others noted that the vehicle fire appeared intense and rapid. Mercedes engineers and independent mechanics later stated that modern cars can combust under certain impact conditions, but that it usually requires external tampering. Investigators reviewed the wreckage and toxicology reports. They found no evidence of drug or alcohol in Hastings' system. They concluded that the crash was accidental. Critics of the official findings claimed that the investigation lacked transparency regarding the vehicle's onboard computer logs. They asked whether telematics data had been recovered and analyzed. They questioned whether the electronic control unit had been tested for intrusion or malfunction. These questions were not addressed at all, leaving room for continued speculation. Another theory focused on the potential pressure connected to Hastings' reporting. The intelligence community had been engaged in leak prosecutions and information control efforts. Several national security whistleblowers had been indicted or charged. The media landscape was tense, especially regarding surveillance programs. Hastings had written about CIA Director John Brennan in a way that challenged these official narratives. He had been active among reporters who covered government secrecy, civil liberties issues, and counterterrorism policies. Supporters of the theory that the car was hacked believed that Hastings' work created institutional risks. Critics of the theory argue that national security state had no incentive to kill a journalist because it would create unnecessary attention. And, you could look at it both ways. A quieter theory suggests that Hastings experienced a mechanical failure unrelated to hacking or foul play. High-speed crashes often involve multiple contributing factors like road conditions and vehicle maintenance, driver fatigue. In other words, somebody could have maybe cut the brake lines. His family stated that he sometimes drove at unsafe speeds. That's not a good look for the conspiracy side of it. And they believe the crash was not the result of an assassination. Others pointed out that the family's statements may have been influenced by grief, uncertainty, or a desire for closure. The discussion produced no consequence, no consensus. A final layer of speculation emerged around information that Hastings allegedly possessed. Some claimed he was working on stories involving powerful private contractors, Pentagon cyber units, and classified surveillance programs. This would be what he potentially was referencing in the emails that he described himself as working on something big. It's just ironic that the guy who's so controversial sends out an email, "Man, I'm working on something big," uncontrollably crashes his car into a tree and dies. Others believe that this target was political in nature. None of the claims are verified, of course, but they continue to circulate. The case remains a point of unresolved debate. The cyber attack of the car is one of the most scary things. This is in the earliest days of Just even the notion that a car can be controlled remotely. Now it's just a common thing. How much would it take to hack into a Tesla and drive it off the road? I really don't know, but it seems like a possibility. You can lean back and read a book and your car will drive you to the store. It's just crazy. What kind of consequence come with that level of convenience? It's hard enough to drive down the road, much less with a bunch of electronically controlled cars. And, sure, they have radar, they have this, they have safety components, but when have you ever in your life had a computer or a machine or an electronic device that didn't ever break once, that didn't ever work improperly once, that didn't ever glitch out or fail? It's unheard of. So you put yourself behind the wheel of something going down the highway that is controlled by a computer. I know, man, I sound old when I say it, but seriously, right? For example, here's an article by Alex Vakulov from January 25th, 2025 on Forbes entitled Cyber Security Threats to Modern Cars, How Hackers Are Taking Control. These are the bullet points from the article. Weak authentication makes it easier for hackers to break into sensitive systems. Centralized systems store large amounts of sensitive user and vehicle information, making breaches more likely. Many connected car platforms do not encrypt data properly, leaving it vulnerable during transmission. Poor integration with third-party apps and portals creates security gaps. And finally, automakers often take too long to find and fix vulnerabilities, leaving vehicles exposed for longer than necessary. And it goes on to give some examples of some of the systems that are vulnerable to attack or have been compromised in the recent past at the time of the writing of the article. And there's a lot of articles about this idea. It's a scary one for sure. So what do you think? Do you think that someone hacked into his car and crashed him into a tree? It was 4 o'clock in the morning. He wasn't drunk. There was no drugs or alcohol in his system. And he went as fast as the car could go and headed on into a tree. Died. Boom. Fire. I don't know. His family did say he liked to drive fast. That's not proof. And technically, there's a lot of information about the fact that, yes, you could hack into a car and make it do things. Turn it off, stop the brakes, floor it. Scary. It's not an easy thing, I wouldn't imagine, but if it's possible, then it can be done. And he did have, high enemies and high places sort of thing. No proof, no conviction, no one even really asking questions about it anymore. That's a perfect crime, if it is one. Leave me a comment in the comments if you're on a platform that allows it, like Spotify. Let me know what your thoughts are. Cybersecurity experts describe technical possibilities, friends describe institutional tensions, critics describe coincidence, and in the end, it's too bad because there's a guy who's gone now. The lack of definitive evidence for any single explanation ensures that speculation will continue. In the end, speculation does not resolve the loss. Michael Hastings left behind family, friends, colleagues, and readers. His work challenged institutions that don't welcome challenge. His life demonstrated that journalism can carry consequences when it confronts power. His death produced debates that reflect the very systems he spent his career examining. Regardless of theory or conclusion, a human life ended. The story of his work remains, and the loss remains one that those who knew him will always live with. We wish all of their family peace. Thank you sincerely for investigating this story with me. Tap follow right now on the app you're listening with so we can meet here next Wednesday to dive deep into another case. If you enjoy these episodes, help me keep making them by joining the Renegade Files Agency on Patreon. As an RFA agent, you get tons of cool stuff, but you also help me keep this show going, keep it independent, and let me make them for you. You make the mission possible. If you're already an RFA agent there, thank you. And if you've thought about doing it, just jump in there. You can try it for free for a week. You can check all the things out that you want to. And then if you decide to stay, for less than you tip a pizza guy, you can help me make Renegade Files. This is episode 110, and we are just getting started. I am so glad to have you in the Renegade Files crew. Until next time, I'm your host, Lex Gordon. Stay wild, militia child.